Good morning, fellow ruminators. Welcome back to another session, Rumination with Andrew. Thank you one more time for joining this session. Now, I want to begin this morning by actually encouraging you to like and share and comment on the videos. Remember now that the more you like and the more you comment, right, that it will trigger the algorithms of YouTube algorithms and other algorithms of other platforms to pass on the video, to share the video with others. Now, we are living in times where we need truth to be disseminated because we're living in an epoch of lies, and we need to ensure that we disseminate truth because truth never changes, right? And truth is what will essentially set us free. Remember now that freedom is not magical. It's not a magical concept. It's not a magical construct. Okay, we are the ones who have to ensure that we keep it, that we maintain it, that we uphold it, right? And truth is the essential ingredient for keeping a democracy and also for keeping freedom intact. It just does not come by this phony and also superficial lives that we are living. All right, our lifestyles and the world in which we live today is too artificial, right? It is not natural. And you can see people also, dressing up with false hair and false eyebrows and eyelashes and all sorts of false things. And I'm not suggesting now that persons who are doing it are terrible, evil, right? But I'm saying that we have become a people, and people who are the ones who make up societies, right? So our societies are generally artificial, our cultures are generally artificial. It means, therefore, that when we are artificial, that we can expect totalitarianism at any given moment, right? Because we have to face reality, right? And people who live in totalitarian regimes or under totalitarian regimes tend not to face realities, all right? And when we go to countries, for example, if you go to Cuba, it's almost like you are in a nightmare, right? The life there does not seem natural, right? Just too much, you wondering if you're living in the 50s, are you living in the 60s, right? And this is how these societies are set up, right? They are not set up to progress, right? And they are not set up to disseminate truth so that its citizens can be liberated, right? Propaganda is what drives these societies. And these are the things that we ought to be aware of. And I think that our societies, particularly our young people, they're so tethered, they're so caught up with technology and this virtual experience that they're not able to keep abreast of the realities of what is happening in the reality. Recently I was watching an influencer, and it's a family, right? And actually it's a family from Jamaica. And the parents were actually saying that they are going to move in this year, they are going to not permit their children, right, to use these social media apps during the week while they're in school, right? So they need to be able to interact with, among their siblings and also with their parents, right? So that is what they have decided to do because they want to make them humans and not just make them or convert them into programmable machines, because most of us really are programmable machines that need to be humanized because we have lost to a great extent our humanity. And then when we have lost our humanities, remember now that the government comes from the people. So if we as citizens have lost our humanity, then when they come to power, they will also wield that power of lost humanity, where they will do horrendous, horrific things to us that we possibly cannot imagine, right? So it's very important that we understand that. In light of that, I will be talking today briefly on totalitarianism. And let us look at the etymology of this word. So we have 1926 first in reference to Italian fascism, formed in English on model of Italian totalitario. And totalitario means complete, absolute, totalitarian, from total. So it means you have total authority, ending from authoritarianism, right? And the noun is recorded from 1938. Now let us look at what an authoritarian, what that word means, right? Favoring imposed order over freedom, right? So you're favoring imposed order over freedom. It means therefore that the government says that this is what you need to do because it's right, it's what will maintain order. Even if it abridges, it restricts your right, then you will have to obey. That is what we call an authoritarian regime. And it's very, very important that you understand that, right? Many of us sometimes do not understand that, correct? Let's continue. Now we have compare authority. No, we have, so we talk about the fact that it means complete and that we lack our freedom, authoritarian, favoring imposed order over freedom, right? Now, what is total, right? So we have, because it's the word totalitarianism comes from total, absolute, right? Having all the power invested in that, in one particular person or institution. Now we have total, right? And that was from the late 14 AD, right? From Old French total, from medieval Latin totalis, right? Totalis, which means entire, total, as in summa totalis, which means sum total, right? So all of this thing, which means totalitarianism, it means having absolute or total control over, right? Anything. A populace could be a populace. That's what we call a totalitarian regime. It means that the government has total control, right, over its citizens, right? That means the citizens are not to be governed by consent, right? So we have to understand that. We tend to be using these words lightly, and people are not reflecting and they're not revisiting the history of these regimes. And it's very, very important that we understand the history, and the history is contextualized so that we'll be able to follow what is happening. Now, in light of that, it's very important also that we begin to educate our children, right, as to what these regimes are all about. Sometimes we tend to shelter our children too much. We think that they're not understanding what is happening around them. But remember now that they will have to deal with elements, these governmental systems, when they grow up, if they're not yet grown up, right? Well, they're still growing up. We assume that they're still children, right? But the fact of the matter is that we must educate them. Don't make them feel like they are, they're incapable of learning about the system, because we're heading there, for all intents and purposes, we are heading in that direction of the totalitarian regime, and we have to be careful. But let's look at 14 points that shows us that points that show us rather, that indicate that we are heading there, or some of us might already be there. All right, but Western society certainly is heading in that direction, and we've got to be careful. The number one is dissent is equated to violence, right? So anytime you have a government that tells you that if you dissent, it's violence, and we hear now that is hate speech, we've got to be careful, right? When they're telling us that, that if you speak and you are in total disagreement with the government, it means that you are hating what the government, which can morph into violence. So that's what they essentially say, that hate speech can morph into violence. And that's what we're seeing with the whole Israeli-Palestinian issue, where if students talk about free the Palestinians because they dissent with what the government is doing, then they can be deemed also as promoting, right? Fomenting violence, right? So that's something that we need to be aware of, right? Now, number two is media is controlled, right? The media is controlled. And in Western society, unfortunately, we see where the media is actually controlled, and people are getting their news from different social medias, some of the news which are not credible, right? But that is what the society has gone to. right? That we don't have any established way of, disseminating truth or disseminating facts, as we would say, right? We do not have that anymore. We don't have any shared values anymore. And that is something that the politicians will certainly take advantage of. Now, number three, the legal system is co-opted by the state, right? So we mean therefore that the state runs the justice system. So it goes in favor of them. So if they actually exploit their citizens, abuse their rights and their privileges, it means therefore that the justice system is going to be in agreement with them. So you must also be alert about what is happening in the justice system now, or the legal system, that is. Now, number four, power is exerted to quash dissent, right? So we have different, in recent times, we've heard of different ministries being set up, like, the misinformation committee or, whatever they've set up so that they can manage the fact-based sort of the fact-checked institutions that they check if your facts are true or not. But oftentimes, nothing is wrong in checking facts, right? So let me put that out there. But it's when you set up a government institution that is merged with corporations, private entities, and firms who are corrupt, who are going to check your facts. The ones who are the major purveyors of disinformation and misinformation are the ones who are going to check whether your information is factual or not. Now, that to me is ironic, and this is what is happening in our society currently. So everything you put out there can be fact-checked, and those institutions are the same ones who are disseminating disinformation and misinformation. Number five, state police protect the regime, not the people. All right, so you have the police that should be protecting us, or that were, employed to protect us, or in fact protecting the interests of the government or the state. Now, the state, as we have suggested in prior videos, can be a merger of private entities along with the government. So you have the financial interests, and you also have the state interest merged together, and they protect each other, right? So you have to understand that. Number six, rights, financial, legal, and civil, are contingent on compliance. So if you want rights, you must comply with what the government says. And we had that played out 3 years ago. But if you did not take a certain medicine, it means therefore that you could not work, or so in some cases, in some countries, you could not even leave your homes, right? So you have to comply with government instructions or mandates, or you will face the consequences, right? Your freedom will be restricted, right? So you must understand that. Number seven, mass conformity of beliefs and behaviors is demanded. So we should all behave the same, right? And I don't have to revisit what happened 3 years ago, right? People have started to behave the same, right? And people have become less critical, and we must all admit that we should trust the whatever right? At all times, we must trust our authoritarian institutions, or else, right? You will be deemed somebody who is anti-society, somebody who's anti-government, somebody who is a psychopath, right? And all of those negative innuendos that can be hurled at you. Now, we also, number eight, let's go to number eight. Power is concentrated in inner ring of elite institutions and people. Let me read that again. Power is concentrated in inner ring of elite institutions and people. And we're seeing that, right? Where, during the pandemic, for example, we understand that huge sums of money, billions of dollars, were transferred from the middle class to the upper echelon of our society. And so we see that our society, the wealth is, and with wealth comes power. So the power is going to be concentrated in the hands of a few elite people, and we must take stock. We must be aware of that. Number nine, semi-organized violence is permitted in some cases, right? So the government will allow in some cases to have violence if it deems it necessary. For example, if the government instructs you to do something and you do not do it, right, the government can act violently against you, right? And sometimes in some cases, people die. And if you watch what is happening in Haiti, you see what happens there. So all of a sudden you have that the Haitians, some of the whom are fighting for their liberties, they are deemed to be terrorists, right? And they are the ones who are trying to attack and to destroy democracy in that country, right? So we have to, and remember now that the media would be working for the government so they can distort the reality. And a lot of people, for some reason, believe what everything that they hear from the media. It amazes me. And I ask myself the question, and I used to be a victim of that too. How is it that we have developed a culture in Western societies in which people sit, intelligent people also sit like lame ducks listening to people who are reading from a teleprompter? Right? Where did we develop that sort of culture that you can sit and listen to someone thinking that they're actually informing you and that you take their word as gospel without even critically assessing what they have said? Even the Bible enjoins upon us to search the scriptures and to study to show thyself approved, right? God wants us to search, not to just believe what we have heard, but when it comes to the news, many of us, if the truth be told, including Christians who read their Bibles, tend to believe what they hear, everything. And I'm not saying you should not listen to the news. That is not my responsibility. That's your right to exercise. But I'm saying, are you critical digesting what they have said to you? Do you go and do further research, or do you just take word for word what they have told you unquestioningly? This is what I'm suggesting that you do not do. Now, number 10, propaganda targets enemies of the state regime. And you know that, so the government issues a decree or a mandate, and then it uses propaganda so that you can believe what the government says. And today in mass media, where we have lots of images, right? Images are hurled at you and you believe what you see. And I've often said to you on this channel that you cannot, in today's world, believe what you see, believe what you hear, sometimes even believe what you touch. You've got to be careful because oftentimes what we see can be distorted images. And we see it on social media a lot, where people can, create images of people's faces and it's not the person, right? It is a virtual person. It is a virtual reality. And people believe, oh yeah, that's the face of Andrew. That's him. He did it, right? Well, it was not necessarily me who did it, right? But it is the sort of societies in which we are living, in which your own picture can be reframed and can be reimaged and can be doctored. And then people will think, and it can be convincing that, yeah, that is the face of that person when it is not. I'm just giving an example. I'm not saying that there are other instances and examples that can also be cited. Now, that's number 11. We're going to number 11. Entire classes singled out for persecution. So that's what has happened during the Holocaust, where you had the Jews, right? You also had in the Spanish Inquisition, that some of you might not have studied. Also, the Jews were singled out to be the problematic people of society, right? And we had ones where Blacks were singled out in the United States as also being problematic when they were fighting for their civil rights and stuff like that. So we have to be careful, right, when government begins to single out a particular person or people and say that they are anti-government and that they are a threat to national security. Be very, very careful. Number 12, extra legal actions are condoned against internal regime opponents. So if you are not, again, in favor of the government, if you are a dissenter, then you can be executed. right? And in most cases, the law will not protect you. That's why we call it extra legal, right? Conditions, because you are not going to be protected by the law. Some people, especially after 9/11, have been critiquing the Patriot Act in the United States. And that is also a law that trumps the Constitution. So if the government should deem you a terrorist, in most cases, even if you're an American citizen, you can be siphoned off to a prison somewhere, not necessarily in America, it could be anywhere in the world, and you won't have the right for defense, right? You cannot have a lawyer because the government has deemed you a terrorist, and that you are, right? And situations like these happened after 9/11, and we've got to take stock, all right? So not because you're an American citizen, it makes you special, and you think that the government cannot siphon you off to another part of the world. It can, if it deems it necessary. If it says that you're a terrorist, then, most people will believe that you probably are one. Now, number 13, harsh legal enforcement against unfavored classes, right? So again, people who the society deems that not to be worthy of citizenship, they will promote, and ramp up this sort of propaganda that these people need to be got rid of. And we saw that also during the Protestant Reformation, where, in Europe, where the Catholics thought that they should purge the nation of all Protestant people. And that's why you had, the wars, and you had the lots of migration, particular to the United States, where people ran because they wanted to be free, right? Because they were not treated as first-class citizens, right? And we must be cognizant of that. One of the things that I find amazing is that people who have been exploited, when they have gotten away from that exploitation, that they come, whatever freedom that they might have obtained in another society, another place, that they begin now to treat others unfairly, because let us look at Americans, who journeyed all the way from Europe, and particularly the European Americans I'm talking about. And upon getting there and getting some form of freedom, then they began to practice slavery against, first it was their own white people, and then against Black people from Africa, right? So that was ironical indeed, because they fled for freedom, in defense of freedom, and then when they got to the United States, after a certain time, they saw nothing wrong with slavery. No, not all people, but of course for the most part. Now, and the last one we're looking at, number 14, is private and public levers of power are used to enforce adherence to state documents. So we're seeing that today with the technology, the big tech and the governments, right? That they are merged together to decide what speech should be permitted on these major platforms, right? So we've got to be aware of that and know that it is not just the private industries that are making these decisions. The government and the private sectors are involved. We understand that during the pandemic, that the government contacted, a lot of the big techs, including Facebook, and coerced them to definitely eliminate content that went against the government's dictates, right? So it's very important that we understand. Some of us are still living in this, in this world where we think it is separate, and you have a separate levers of power in government. So that is no longer the case. We do not have to do, separation of powers. Okay. I think it only exists in theory. And it's not that we shouldn't study the theory and try to defend it in the practice, but we must understand, we must also not believe that the powers are separate in any form or shape. So that is something that I wanted to say to you and for you to understand and and to think about. Okay, now equality in the original sense means that, wealth should be equally distributed, right? And Now, so we want to make sure that we do not have false notions or superficial understandings of what totalitarianism is about. All right. When we see totalitarianism at play, we ought to debunk it, and we ought to try to fight against it. Right. So we're seeing elements of that. We're seeing examples of totalitarianism in our societies, in our current Western societies. And it is our responsibility, okay, to ensure that we preserve the freedoms that we were bequeathed when we were born. Remember now that generations come after us, right? And we have to preserve it. It's our responsibility to preserve these rights for the generation that will, our generations rather, that will come after us. A lot of us don't care because we think if we're enjoying some amount of freedom now, then why care about what comes afterwards? But that's not how societies operate, right? We have to think about the next generations, or civilization will end as we know it, right? So I hope that you think and you reflect on these things, and you look at these signs carefully, you observe them in your society, and if you see elements of these signs, that you begin to let your voices be heard. And perhaps if you can take action, you do take actions by writing to your congressman or congresswoman or your politician, your member of parliament, wherever you live. I'm not sure if you're living in a parliamentarian democracy or a congressional democracy. Whatever situation or reality you find yourself in, remember, please, you need to fight against any form of totalitarian regime. Thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.